As you may have already figured out, the title of this podcast is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. On making no effort. The problem for us poor human beings, and particularly using the language that we use, is that we can only think in terms of doing and of making effort. And so the negatives of those, non-doing and not making effort, kind of imply doing and making effort, so it's very difficult to talk about. But anyway, this is essentially a podcast of an entry, a new article on the Corporeal Fantasy website called On Making No Effort. So I shall sort of read it fairly verbatim, but probably make some comments as well. So one of the most difficult things to achieve in this life is to give up on making efforts. And yes, I'm aware that there is a paradox buried in that statement, but paradox is the engine of truth. If you smell a paradox somewhere, then there's possibly something worth chasing down. In any case, by the time we become young adults, we have learned that the only way to achieve anything is through effort. School, at work, seduction, physical training, and so on. In fact, everything we do is driven by a goal, an idea of achieving something. All desires are driven by some idea of an end point. And that end point may be having a meal, so we go and cook, or some training to get a better job, whatever it is, we're driven in this kind of way. So, as I've mentioned many times in podcasts and on this blog, virtually all our efforts are driven by the will to life, or the survival instinct. And I've talked extensively about this in other podcasts, so if you want to get more of what the will to life is about, go and listen to some of the other podcasts. The will to life is essentially an unconscious and unconscionable force that causes all creatures to strive to continue in their existence and to breed, to continue the species. So, if we had no reflective consciousness, we would behave as other animals and simply strive to exist and rear our young and then die. And you don't have to be Albert Einstein to realize that our lifespan is sort of geared around rearing the next generation. So we get to the age of maybe 20 or 30, we have kids, get them off our hands, by which time we're 40 or 50 or maybe even older these days. And at which point health starts to decline, our facilities start to decline, and we eventually die, having served the purpose of nature of delivering the next generation. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you view it, we do have a reflective consciousness. We can form concepts and think about things, which seems to be quite unique in the world of animals. And so we can look at our life and ask whether we simply want to be a slave to nature, driven by desires, suffering the emotions that are a result of these desires being fulfilled or otherwise. And in actual fact, we're always going to be a slave to nature. We don't have any choice in that. But as Spinoza and Gurdjieff and various other people have said, you can either be a conscious slave of nature or an unconscious one. So you either suffer consciously or you suffer unconsciously. It's your choice. Well, actually it's not your choice. Many people will not be aware of these things, and so they don't really have any choice. Once we have identified desire to be the root cause of our suffering, and that all desires derive from the desire to live, the Buddhists nailed it when they said, All our suffering comes from the desire to exist. Think about it. It's kind of obvious, but actually it's very profound as well. We can then make efforts to understand these desires, the emotions, and how we might be less affected by them. But there is a twist. All effort comes from the beast. I call it the beast. The will to life, without exception. And since we are mainly beast, so we have a hard time understanding how we might free ourselves from its tyranny. The tyranny is that you are driven day in, day out to strive to exist and to do all the things that people do to achieve that. And even your philosophical and so-called spiritual activities may actually just be from the beast, driven by some idea of an end goal and the actions that you need to perform to achieve that end goal. So, this is the wickedness, really, of the idea of enlightenment. People form some idea of an end goal, and then they strive for years and years and years to try and achieve that end goal, which is exactly the opposite direction they should be going. So, various sages and philosophers have indicated what we need to do, although even the word do is loaded with the notion of desire. Gurdjieff said we should let our non-desires dominate our desires. It's in Beelzebub's Tales, and in my opinion, one of the most profound things he said in there. Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching says that things like the grass makes no effort to grow, and a storm has no fixed schedule or timescale. It just appears when it appears, does what it does, and then disappears. There's nothing forced. And there's no idea of an end, some end point in it all. Many Gurdjieff groupies interpret his statement of non-desires should dominate desires to mean that they should do the things they do not want to do. But you don't need to be all that bright to figure out that in order to do these things that they don't want to do, they ultimately have to convince themselves that they do want to do them. And so the result is not a non-desire. So, this statement of do the things you do not want to do from Gurdjieff, it's pure Zen. It's a statement that would hopefully cause people to think and to figure out for themselves that actually trying to do the things you do not want to do means that you end up wanting to do the things you don't want to do. It's a nonsense statement. So we should let no desire dominate desire, because non-desires are actually no desire. No desire, what does that feel like? Of course, then we desire to have no desire. Unfortunately, our language does not help here. For example, the only way we can express the opposite of doing is by saying non-doing. Non-desire, non-doing, and by implication, no effort is where we should go, but oh dear, the word go implies action. Seems like we're in a trap. Since we can only think in terms of doing, of effort, of goals and preferred states. And so we find people chasing after enlightenment, moksha, mindfulness, and any number of other seemingly preferred states. And by the way, for those people who practice mindfulness, mindfulness is the end result of something. It's not a cause of something. You can't practice mindfulness. You are either mindful or you are not. You can't kind of fake it. Anyway. Fortunately, nature cannot hide its intentions and its deceptions. Its most obvious deception is the inbuilt sentiment that every creature has, that it is the center of the universe. This leads inevitably to a sense of self-importance, and each creature experiences itself as the only thing that matters in the whole world. It should be fairly obvious that none of us have some important role to play. The world will get along fine without us, and so nothing we think, nothing we do, nothing we feel or any purpose we may think we have is the least bit important. And that's a very, very objective assessment of it. You may be filled with the importance of your own projects and ideas, but actually they are not the least bit important. And if you can realize within yourself that they're not the least bit important to you as well, then there's a certain inner freedom associated with that. It is extremely important that we realize nothing is important, including this statement. This is our get out of jail card. The times when we think we have discovered the secret to freedom, how to be happy, that we understand how everything works, or simply the expectation that some new practice or knowledge is going to set us free, we can remember that it is not the least bit important, and it's not the least bit important that you should be free. Obviously the ego does not like this, and so there will be resistance. But if you remember that the resistance is also not important, and that your so-called efforts are not important, then you may indeed get a taste of inner freedom. So here's a list of things we can do, that word do again, none of which are important, and which might help us abandon the addiction to effort. Number 1, nothing is important, including the idea that nothing is important. Number 2, it is not the least bit important that you should recognize when you have a gaining idea. The idea of gain is our default mechanism for doing things. When you see you have attached some idea of gain to an action, simply acknowledge it and move on. Do not try to resist the gaining idea, because then you simply create another gaining idea to stop the gaining idea. Number 3, do not resist anything within yourself. If you see ambition in yourself in the work environment, or ambition in your play, or ambition in your relationships with others, just observe it and let it be. In fact, if you see anything going on within yourself, greed, anger, whatever it is, just observe it and let it be. To resist these things would mean that you take them seriously, and that you have decided that there is a preferred state. There is never a state that is preferable to the state you are in right here and now. Number 4, finally, remember that all efforts come from the will to life. If you see yourself making efforts, then just observe them and move on. To make efforts to try and eliminate effort is the ultimate folly. I can't pretend that this is anything but tricky work, but I've found in my experience that the constant remembrance of my own nothingness, and that nothing I think or feel is the least bit important to me or anyone else, usually breaks the logjam of emotions and thoughts that crowd our inner world. But breaking the logjam isn't important either. Finally, a word from Lao Tzu. A good traveller has no fixed plans and is not intent on arriving. But guess what? Lao Tzu isn't important either.